Dr. Ruth. We're so happy to have you back, and we're so glad that you agreed to reschedule despite the sudden crisis that has come in, and we're very thankful for that. Today's session is being chaired and moderated by our MPhil scholar, Jubair. He's working on Persianate cultures of South India in pre-modern times. Over to you, Jubair, to handle the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiba ma'am. Good evening, all, and a special good morning to Professor Ruth Vanida. I welcome all of you to the ninth lecture of the International Workshop on Sensing Past, Thematic Departures, and Archival Sources, conducted by Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, in association with Kerala Council for Historical Research. My name is Muhammad Jubair, and I do MPhil History in the department. Today, we are fortunate to have a distinguished scholar, activist, and author, Professor Ruth Vanida, who specializes in literary history with a focus on gender and sexuality studies. There are a set of general instructions for the participants. First, all of the participants are requested to mute their audio throughout the session. Second, registered participants, please mark your attendance in the Google form, which will be circulated shortly. And third, if you have any questions, please type it down in the chat box. I'll be reading out to the speaker on your behalf, citing your names right after the lecture. So let me invite Mr. Sudhi CJ, PhD research scholar, to formally introduce the speaker and welcome the gathering. Sudhi, please.
Good evening, one and all, and a very good morning to Dr. Ruth Vanida, the speaker of the day. This is the ninth session of the ongoing online workshop, Sensing the Past, Thematic Departures and Archival Searches, organized by the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, supported by Kerala Council for Historical Research. The speaker of the day, Dr. Ruth Vanida. Dr. Ruth Vanida is an academician, author, and an advocate of women's movement in India. Dr. Ruth commands a tremendous understanding of lesbian and gay studies, gender and sexuality, and the representation of LGBTQ issues in literature and media. In 1978, Vanita co-founded Manushi, the first feminist magazine. She served as the journalist's unpaid volunteer co-editor from 1978 to 1990. Dr. Ruth was born in Rangoon, Burma, and brought up in Delhi. She did her bachelor's and master's in Miranda House, University of Delhi, and started her teaching career in Miranda House itself. Did her PhD from Delhi University and taught in Delhi University for 20 long years as well. Some of her important works includes A Play of Life, Selected Poems, Sappho and the Virgin Mary, Same-Sex Love and the English Literary Imagination, Love Strife, Same-Sex Marriage in India and West, Gender, Sex and the City, Urdu Rekti Poetry in India, 1780 to 1870, Dancing with the Nation, Courtesans in Bombay Cinema. Another important work, Same-Sex Love in India, Readings from Literature and History, which is co-edited along with Salim Kitwai. She has also translated several works of fiction and poetry from Hindi and Urdu to English. Dr. Ruth Vanida is now working as a professor in the Department of History, College of Humanities and Science, University of Montana. She is also the co-director of South and Southeast Asian Studies. Dr. Ruth's lectures will be based on 3 books written by her. She will discuss the process and sources for writing those books. I would like to give a brief introduction to those books. Love Strife, Same-Sex Marriage in India and West, which is published in the year 2005. First book to examine the same-sex weddings and same-sex couple suicide in the last 2 decades of the last century. The book also examining the changing legal, literary, religious, social, Indian and Euro-American traditions within which same-sex unions are embedded. Second book, Gender, Sex and the City, Urdu Rekti Poetry in India, 1780 to 1870, which is published in the year 2012. The book explores the urban cosmopolitan sensibilities of Urdu poetry written in the late 18th century and early 19th century in Lucknow. The author analyzes the Rekti, a type of Urdu poetry distinguished by a female speaker and focus on women's lives. So how it became a catalyst for the transformation of ghazals. The book explores a pre-colonial society that was modern, urban, more open to pleasure, to play to different types of romantic relationship and friendship than colonial and post-colonial Indian society. Memory of Light, the latest book, which was published a few months back, is Ruth Vanitha's first book of fiction. It's a novel. It's a same-sex love story. Memory of Light emerges out of the writer's imagination of the pre-colonial world of courtesans and poets, and the up and downs of the relationship between two courtesans, Chabla Bai and Nafis Bai, unfolds against the backdrop of Nawabi era of Lucknow. I would like to welcome all the participants joined from different parts of the globe to this session, and I welcome Dr. Ruth Vanitha on behalf of Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Kaladi, and behalf of all the participants present here for the keynote address. Thank you.
Okay, should I start? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, of course. Please.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about the 3 books that were just mentioned, but also about I'll mention a few other books. So I've been exploring gender, sexuality, and the erotic imagination for about 25 years, looking both at Indian and British literatures and cultures. So I'm going to outline some of the tendencies in my work that have emerged and some of the kind of principles I have followed. And I'll briefly mention them at the start, and then when I talk about particular books, I'll describe it more. So my first work was, early work was essays on Shakespeare, and then I did the first PhD dissertation on same-sex relationships from the English department at Delhi University. It was the first from that department. It was mentioned that I worked in the women's movement for 13 years. Can you hear me? Some people are saying they can't hear. So I've got the volume on maximum, so I don't know what.
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Yes, you're audible, ma'am.
We are audible.
Okay. I should say that the women's movement at that time was very different from what it is now. And at that time, when I was working in it, the women's movement was very much focused only on oppression of poor women and domestic violence, rape, etc., and was not willing to talk about sexuality and at all in general, and especially not on same-sex sexuality. So in fact, it was, in respect to doing this work, I felt a certain liberation at leaving the women's movement and conducting my own research, my own work. Okay, so some of the principles that I have followed when approaching primary sources have been the following. One is try to approach the text with as few preconceptions as possible. And it's impossible to get rid of all preconceptions, but as few as possible with an open mind and take the text on its own terms, at least on the first reading. For example, don't assume, I don't assume, I'm not telling you what to do, but I myself don't assume that all patriarchal texts are going to be anti-women, because what is a patriarchal text? Every text is patriarchal. If you're living in a patriarchal, just very simply a male-dominated society, then every text is patriarchal. So then you may as well not read if you're going to assume that every text is anti-women. And that is connected, that's just one example. That's connected to the next point, which is do not homogenize or essentialize a group. And often we do this without realizing that we are doing it. For instance, don't assume, which many writers did, that all Muslim men in the 18th century in India would have been homophobic or they would have been anti-women. That's not necessarily the case. People of a group don't all think alike. Don't assume that all, if you're reading an ancient text, that all Brahmins are anti-non-Brahmins or they are anti-women or whatever. People in any society, in any group, not everyone thinks alike. Third point, as I said, approach the text on the text's own terms. What is the text trying to do? Don't expect the text to do things that you want to have done. Then you write your own text. You approach the text on what is it trying to do, and critique later. At least at the first reading, approach it on its own terms, and don't start with a negative attitude to the text. That is the way I have approached things. And then, as far as possible, not to impose an external theoretical framework on the text, whether it's Foucault or Derrida or Marx or Freud or Lacan or any religion, or even while reading the Mahabharata, don't impose the Manusmriti and imagine that every writer of that time had to be following the Manusmriti. That's not the case at all. So try not to impose external frameworks on the text that the text is not itself giving you. And then I'll come to, and a close reading, I'll give you one example. Reading closely a text, it has to be read in the context of the whole work. You can't, I don't think one should select one line and then say, oh, this is what it is saying about this. Make a statement on that basis without looking at what is around that. For example, I'll give you an example. Before I started working on this, several people, in fact, had written about the Manusmriti and said that the Manusmriti says, and they quoted the one verse, that when a non-virgin woman has sex with a virgin woman and she loses her virginity, and then that non-virgin woman has to be punished by blackening her face, cutting off her fingers, making her ride on a donkey, and she has to pay the dowry of that virgin woman. So this was assumed to mean, oh, they are really anti-female sex, and it is an anti, what we would call lesbian kind of statement. But what they didn't do is look at the verse immediately before that, which says, if a man is with a virgin woman and he manually, that is with a finger, penetrates her and she loses her virginity, then the same exact punishment is mentioned. His face should be blackened, his fingers cut off, he's ridden on a donkey, and he has to pay her dowry. And obviously the focus here is not on the sex of the two partners. The focus is on the virgin woman losing her virginity and becoming difficult for her to get married. And that is what it's about. So whether the person doing that is a man or a woman is irrelevant, because the two verses say exactly the same thing. Yeah. Thirdly, the Manusmriti doesn't say anything about two non-virgin women having sex. If they've already lost their virginity, they're married or they're non-virgin, then it doesn't mention that at all. So one has to look at what the text is saying, what else it is saying, and what it is not saying is also equally important. Virginia Woolf said that whenever you're, always leave the trodden path and follow the byways. If there are any byways, follow those. And I found that a very useful piece of advice. While working on my first book, Sappho and the Virgin Mary, I found that, I'm going to share the PowerPoint now. Let's see. Can you see it? Hello? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Not
No.
yet.
No.
Okay, let
No.
me try.
No, ma'am.
You still can't see it?
There is yes. It's coming now.
Okay, all right. So this was the first book. And when I worked on this book for about 10 months, I was writing this book, I started off with one idea, and as I kept finding more things, this is the first book in which I also worked on primary sources. I looked at the first English translations of Sappho's poetry in manuscript form. And here comes another principle, which is that the whole idea of the center and the margins. So when I started this book, most people assumed that anything which is about same-sex love must be in the margins of the literature. It must be done by minor writers, by women to whom no one was paying any attention. And I found that not to be the case. I found that they were writing about female-female love and even male-male love. Every major writer was mentioning Sappho, who was the first great Greek lyricist and who wrote about the first to write about female-female love in the Western tradition. And because she was so major, she was not minor, she was major, every writer, whether it was John Donne or Byron or any number of novelists, Jane Austen, etc., they were aware of female-female love, And my argument was that female-female relationships are at the center and the heart of the canon of major writers as well as minor writers, and not just at the margins. I think the whole idea of the center and the margins can become too rigid. The center and the margins are always changing. Let me give you an example. John Keats, for example, who died at the age of 25, he thought in his life, he was a totally marginal writer. Nobody thought highly of his work. Very few people thought highly of his work. And he was poor. He had never been to the university. He was totally marginalized. But after his death, after some years, he became central. So things keep shifting. You don't know what is center and what is margin. Anyway, so then to come to the next book that I worked on. Hello? The next book was Same-Sex Love in India. When we started working on this book, I had heard of hardly any writers in Indian literature. At the time I was being educated, homosexuality was never mentioned in the class. And I had heard of Firak Gorakhpuri and of Amrita Shergill. I was pretty much ignorant of our own literature. I mean, of course, I knew the stories, but I hadn't read the original text. So for this book, I did a lot of reading. Yes? Hello?
Please continue, ma'am. Please continue.
I read the epics, I read the Purans, at that time in translation. I read the epics and the Purans. And I learned a lot, not just on this subject, but on culture, on philosophy, on literature. And I made some amazing discoveries. I think the most important discovery was the discovery of, this is the updated version, 2008 version, the discovery of the story of Bhagirath, Bengali, written in Bengali and Sanskrit, the stories of Bhagirath produced in Bengal, 14th century onwards, which tell the story of two widows who have a relationship, a sexual relationship, and one of them becomes pregnant. And then that leads to all kinds of really interesting developments. And finally, she gives birth to a child who is Bhagirath, the great hero who brings the Ganga down from heaven. I think this is pretty much the only example in world literature of a child being born to two women having a sexual relationship together. I find it very interesting because it's kind of like imagining. The writers of the time would have seen, of course, they were familiar with stories of the goddess produces beings out of herself. The idea that the female can be fertile herself was an idea that was present. And secondly, they would have seen many co-wives, many women raising children together. And so the idea that two co-wives could be mothers, could be co-mothers, that idea is already there. Rama, for example, calls all his father's wives his mothers. But can they be biological mothers together? This is something that the story imagines or envisions. It looks forward. It imagines something that would not have been possible. It imagines what if this was possible. So basically, and another very interesting thing in this text was that I read the ancient medical texts from the 1st, 2nd century, Sushruta Samhita and Charaka Samhita, and also the Mahabharata mentions that if two women have sex and one of them somehow becomes pregnant, then the child which will result will have no bones, because it is the father who gives the bones, who contributes the hard parts of the body, the bones, the nails, etc., and the mother, the flesh and blood. So it will be a boneless child. And that was 1st, 2nd century. But in this 14th century text onwards, in these texts also that idea resurfaces. So it suggests a certain continuity of the tradition, that the authors knew this idea of the boneless child. So the child born to these two women, in some of the stories, the child is born without any bones and then is cured, miraculously cured. And different versions of the story, the cure takes place in different ways. And then the child becomes, of course, a heroic child. I also read I read the Kama Sutra, and I read later versions of the Kama Sutra. For example, the 15th century Anangaranga Sanskrit text. I found beautiful descriptions that have not been noticed of female orgasm, of the actual mention of the clitoris, which has a lovely name. It is called the umbrella of Manmatha. Manmatha is the god Kama, the god of love. And it is called the umbrella of the god of love. And it's also called Bhaganasa. So there are various words for it. So there's a great deal of knowledge of what female orgasm is about. I wrote about this text, about Anangaranga and other texts, in this collection of essays in 2005. And then I'll come to Love's Right, which was mentioned. Now, Love's Right, I had been, in terms of the sources, I had been collecting clippings, newspaper clippings and reports from 1980 onwards. So this was written in, published in 2005. So from 1980, I had been collecting these reports wherever I found them of young women, mostly young women, there were a few men also, young women either committing joint suicide together, two women committing joint suicide together, or two women getting married by religious ritual. And I found many, many of these. Of course, the phenomenon is still going on today. This book is the only book-length study of these phenomena. So my question was, these young women, if you look at them, what do they have in common? All these young female couples, they were non-English speaking. They were lower income groups, what we could call working class or maximum lower middle class, rural and small town girls, and they had no contact with any movement, no women's movement, no LGBT movement. They didn't even know any words for like lesbian or gay or anything of the kind. The first joint suicide was in 1980 in Kerala. Malika and Lalita Ambika, they attempted to drown themselves together. And 1987 was the first, and then there were many other joint suicides in the 1980s. In 1987, the first, the famous case of Leela and Urmila in Madhya Pradesh, who were two policewomen who got married by Hindu religious rites. And one of them was a divorcee, one of them was a widow. And then their family, interestingly, their family supported them, at least Urmila's family supported her and actually arranged a little party for them. They were policewomen, and when they got married, the police suspended them from their jobs. But the family supported them. They had a little ceremony for them, a little reception, and they said we wanted to cheer them up, so they invited the guests. And it was in a village. And journalists went there. This case actually made national headlines. And journalists asked the people there, what do they think about this? And interestingly, one of the women neighbors of Urmila, who was a school teacher, village school teacher, she said, after all, what is marriage? It is a wedding of two souls. Where in the scriptures is it said that it has to be between a man and a woman? I was so fascinated by this comment. And I was just wondering why, my question was, why do all these women who have no connection with each other, who are in all parts of the country and also in Nepal, not just in India, why do they all do the same thing? They either get married by religious rites, or they commit joint suicide, or they do both. First they get married, put sindoor in each other's parting and put garlands on, and then they commit suicide. And many of them left suicide notes saying we want to be buried together or we want to be cremated together. And these women come from all communities. There are Hindus, there are Muslims, there are Dalits, there are Christians, there are tribals, there are all professions. There are fisher women, agricultural workers, students. They're all very young though. That is another thing they have in common. In 2001, two nurses, Jaya and Tanuja, got married and by religious rites. And interestingly, their parents are one of them, actually arranged a wedding of them and at the same time, Jaya's sister got married to a man. So it was a joint wedding, which many people do to save money. And the priest performed both the weddings together. There were 200 guests. Of course, the next day they went to the marriage registrar and tried to get the marriage registered. And it was a woman. The marriage registrar refused to. She said, you can do whatever you like, but the government won't recognize this. So, and then the landlord of the house they were living in threw them out, gave them notice. So they faced a lot of social prejudice. But the interesting thing was that some families did persecute these women, try to separate them, force them, basically drove them to suicide. But some families actually supported them. They came around. First they disapproved, but then after realizing, no, they really want to get married, they came around. So my other question was, why do some families accept this? What is this about the language of marriage and of death that is understood? And so I looked then at history, at the history of marriage, at the history of literature, the history of marriage in the West, where marriage used to be something just recognized by the community, as it still is in many parts of India. You don't get it registered with the state. Many poor people, yes, perform the ceremony and their community recognizes it. There's no need to go to the government, because what is the government going to do? In the West, marriage was a community affair. It was taken over by the church gradually in the 13th century, so that's pretty late. And then it was taken over by the government or the state only first in 1789, after the French Revolution, so that late in time. So Hindu marriage at least continues, and Muslim marriage too, continues to have a very strong community element. Under Hindu law, any ceremony that is customary in a particular community is recognized as legal. If in your community just garlanding each other is marriage, then that is marriage. But if in your community it's a 3-day ceremony or a 5-day ceremony, then that is marriage. It is defined by your customs of your community. But under the British, the state started interfering and trying to regulate sexuality by removing every arrangement like same-sex relationships, courtesans, polygamy, polyandry, and so on. Every arrangement that was not heterosexual monogamous marriage was basically removed. And this process of the state trying to control all relationships, this continued in independent India. So while doing this, after I did this book, I realized that I made a mistake, and and this is another principle of my research, which I've applied in future books, is that at the same time as these same-sex marriages and suicides were continuing, there were also cross-sex marriages and suicides that were continuing, maybe more in number because there are more cross-sex relationships. So there were many, many cases of a young man and a young woman trying to get married, the family opposing it for whatever series of reasons, and then the young man and woman committing suicide and leaving a suicide note saying bury us together or cremate us together, or running away and getting married by religious rituals. So there was a parallel exact pattern in both. The only major difference is that if a young man and woman get married by religious rites or in the civil under civil marriage, their marriage is recognized by the government. That's the major difference. So they get whatever rights a married couple gets. If 2 women or 2 men, as many of them did, get married by religious rituals, it is a religious marriage. It's recognized by the religion, but some priests performed it, so some priests recognized it. But the government does not recognize it, and they don't get any rights. So they can be harassed and so on. They don't get any rights. That was the major difference. But I think it would be very interesting to look at both together and to see the common patterns and the differences. But it is interesting that the joint suicides at least were happening both for cross-sex couples and for same-sex couples. And my book basically studied only same-sex couples. I mentioned the cross-sex, but I didn't count. I hadn't collected the reports. I didn't have the numbers for that. Okay. So then to go on to the next book. The next book, Gender, Sex and the City. Now, this grew out of my work on same-sex love in India. Now, when we studied, for same-sex love in India, I was responsible for the whole Sanskritic tradition and for a lot of the modern literature. And Salim was responsible for the medieval literature in Persian, Turkish, Urdu, etc. But in this process, Urdu, of course, is pretty much the same language as Hindi. When you read it aloud, it's the same. When you speak it, it's the same. Only the script is different. So in this book, we wrote about, Salim knew about it, and we found out more about this kind of poetry called Rekhti. And Rekhti is a kind of Urdu poetry in which has a woman speaker, not a woman writer necessarily, but a woman speaker, a woman speaking. And in the Rekhti produced in Lucknow in the 18th and 19th centuries, most of this poetry is women talking about their lives, all aspects of their lives, like shopping and neighbors and friends and quarrels, etc. But interestingly, not about being wives and mothers. And that is quite unique to have a poetry in which women are speaking about women's lives, but not speaking about being wives and mothers, rather speaking about their love relationships. And the second really unique thing about this body of poetry is that most of the love relationships, I would say like over 90%, are between women. And who are these women? They could be regular conventional women, and some of them could be tawaifs, so what in English would be called courtesans, right? And the poets show that there isn't that much difference between the two as we think. So in Urdu, there's supposed to be this great difference between tawaifs and sharif, respectable conventional women, and courtesans. But the interesting thing about this poetry is that it shows that there's a lot in common between these women's lives. They have love relationships, friendships, they are interested in cosmetics and jewelry and dress and excursions and pleasure and food, and they have servants and they have relationships with they have quarrels with their neighbors and friendships with their neighbors. They go out in the city. So there isn't that much difference between them. So we had, at the time when we collected this poetry for this book, we could find very little in Urdu. Very little was published in tiny, small books, just a few selections. And wherever there was anything sexually explicit, you would find mostly dot, 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 ellipses. It wasn't the complete poem, because whatever was considered, was explicit about same-sex relations was considered to be obscene and was removed. So many of the major poets of the time had written this kind of poetry. So they wrote two kinds of poetry, a lot of poetry with the male speaker, typical ghazal, and a lot of poetry, the same kind of ghazals, but written with a female speaker. Yeah. So I wanted to know more about this poetry. And so I learned Urdu. And this comes to my next principle of research, which is learn languages, as many languages as you can learn. And especially if you're researching it, knowing the language, original language, I think is very important. Working in translation is not at all the same thing. If you have to work in translation, then I think having a native speaker with you and who reads it aloud to you, and you go through word by word with the dictionary to check the translation, the quality of the translation. If 2 or 3 translations are available, to compare those translations. But really, if you're going to do research on the primary source, I think you need to know the language. I think there is a lot of work to be done on Indian languages still. There are numerous languages in which hardly any work has been done, and the manuscripts are actually disappearing as we speak. They are being eaten up by termites and destroyed, and so on. So I wanted to read this poetry in the original. I learned Urdu for that. And then I had to go to the libraries, and all this poetry had disappeared from publication. Some of it had never been published, and some of it was out of print. So I had to go to the libraries and read the manuscripts in the original, which was very difficult to begin with, because when you're reading 19th century manuscripts, Urdu is written differently from the way it is written today. So it took me quite a while to understand how that is written. And then I had to copy it out by pencil, because in some of these libraries, you weren't allowed to photocopy, you weren't allowed to take photographs. And so I had to write out by pencil. Also, I was being watched all the time by the custodians of the library who were wondering why I'm reading this poetry. The other interesting thing about this poetry is that when you read it aloud, as I read it aloud to modern audiences, it is completely colloquial, very modern, very understandable, and it is very playful and full of fun and humor and happy relationships, very different from the kind of Urdu ghazal that becomes extremely famous in the 20th century, which is all about pining and being separate and lovers being separated and dying and so on. This poetry is not like that. It is about happy and fun love. There is also separation and sadness, but not only that. The other reason for writing this, for doing this research for this book, was that I wanted to know what sexuality was like in a city, in a culture which was pre-colonial. So in this book, in Same-Sex Love in India, we had argued, and I still that's still my basis, my assumption, is that a big change comes about with the British. That basically same-sex love, courtesans, all kinds of sexuality become illegal and criminalized and also despised after the British takeover, basically post 1857. I'm talking about North India though. That it's not just about sexuality, and this I would say for the whole of India pretty much. It's not just about sexuality, but the whole attitude to pleasure and to play changes with the British. Not just with the British, British are Victorians at this time, so there's a certain puritanism in their approach to life and to pleasure. And the nationalists, the Indian social reformers and nationalists of all stripes, and I would say from left to right, everyone, whether it's Gandhian or communist or Hindu Mahasabha or Muslim League, all of them, the attitude, they internalize the British attitudes that everything that was earlier is somehow shameful. Polygamy, polyandry, courtesans, same-sex relationships, drinking wine, all of this is shameful, and we should only be focused on changing society and on, we should always have a moral purpose to everything we read and everything we do. So pleasure for its own sake, playfulness for its own sake, these become kind of embarrassing. And any poetry that is just about love and just about wine and just about sex becomes obscene, is labeled obscene. And that is what happened to this poetry, the Urdu Rekhti poetry. It was labeled obscene. And not only the poetry in women's voices, but a lot of poetry in men's voices. So the same poets. So some of my poets were poets like Insha, Rangeen, Jurrat. These are the names, their pen names. They also wrote very similar poetry with a male speaker and with a lot of the same things going on, but with significant differences. And because they wrote this poetry about same-sex love, I think that was the primary reason, most of their writings have disappeared and have gone out of print. After I did this research, some of the Rekhti poetry in women's voices has come back into print. In fact, there was somebody in JNU who did a PhD dissertation to bring it back into print, and it came back into print. But their other poetry in the male voice still is not available. Very hard to get hold of. Some of it is just in manuscript, some of it is in out-of-print books. But what was interesting was I found in reading these poets' works, and this is my another principle of research, which is look also at the other work. Now, everybody who had written about Rekhti poetry before I did, they read only the Rekhti poetry, only the poetry in women's voices. And then they came to all kinds of conclusions from that. Oh, men are writing about women in women's voices, men are behaving like boyars, men are being funny about this, they think it's very funny that women are having relations. Okay, now when I read the other writings by these poets, where they were talking about male-female love or male-male love, and where they had a male speaker, I found the tones to be exactly the same. They were writing in the same playful, funny tones about male-female love also, even with a male speaker, the same tones. So then I realized that you have to read other stuff, almost everything that a writer has written, in order to understand any part of it. Otherwise, if you only pick out one part, and you can reach completely wrong conclusions. So what I found was that these poets, and I studied 7 poets from Delhi, from Lucknow, and from Hyderabad, these poets were. So Kes was from Hyderabad. I found that they write about relationships between a man and a woman, between 2 women, and between 2 men, equally openly, in the same range of tones, from romance to fun to sadness to humor, the same range of tones. Yeah, and these were not minor poets. Some of them are very, very major poets. Insha is still considered a very major poet, but in that time, Rangeen and Judat were also extremely popular poets. They were they were all Muslim. They were all living in a mixed Hindu-Muslim society with Muslim rulers, Shia rulers, I should say Shia rulers, and that might make a difference. And they were openly writing in ways that it would be very difficult to write today. They were practicing Muslims. Some of them were Sufi inclined, but they wrote about religion in a playful way. They wrote about sex in a playful way. They were pretty uninhibited and uncensored, which would not be possible today to write in this way. And the other interesting thing is that at the same time, that same period, say around 1820, in England, the other side of the world, from where the British rulers came, you could take the example of a poet like Byron, who was also writing about male-male love, his relationships with men, but writing it in a hidden way. He was changing the pronouns to change it into, he wrote about women, but he also wrote about men. And when he wrote about men, he changed the pronouns from he to she, and he gave female names to his male beloved. Because in England at the time, you could be executed for same-sex relations. In India, there was no such thing. It was until 1861, when the British brought in the Indian Penal Code 377, nobody, as far as we could find out in history, had been executed for same-sex relations. So this was, all of this was a real revelation to me. And from, say, okay, I'll come to that later. But another very interesting thing which I found in these manuscripts were the poets and writing. They had a series of words, and these words are found in dictionaries also of the time, for a woman's female lover. So there were many words for a woman's female lover or close intimate friend. There wasn't an absolute distinction between an intimate friend and a lover. And I think that is an old Indian tradition. You can be very close, and whether you are sexually involved or not is not the main thing. The main thing is that you are most important to each other. And so there were lots of words, Dogana, Zanaki, Elaichi, Guiyan, etc. And some of these words were still being used in the 1970s. One historian, Veena Oldenburg, found that some of these words were still being used in the 1970s. But something that I found was this descriptions of women getting married to each other. So there's a poet called Rangeen, and he gave a description. He says, 2 women each take a cardamom and break it open. The one in whose cardamom there's an even number of seeds becomes the male, and the one in whose cardamom there's an odd number of seeds becomes the woman. So it's totally arbitrary. It isn't that one is more inclined to behave like a boy and like a girl. No, it's just arbitrary. You just break it and say. And then they get married among their female companions, and these are called Elaichi. So the 2 women are called cardamom, Elaichi, each other's cardamom. And there were many rituals in which women performed to create these female couples, which he describes and others describe. But this one, he says, then they get married. He actually uses the word marriage, shadi, among their female companions. Now, among their female companions is interesting. So these women might have been already married to men, we don't know. Or they might have been tawafs, or having long-term relationships with men, courtesans. But among their female companions, they had their own relationships, which only the women community may have known about. And these are called ilaichis, he says. So I found that very interesting. And that is what in my novel, which just appeared in July this year, I wanted to explore imaginatively, having looked at this universe, this world in which same-sex relationships were openly written about. I wanted to see what it would be like for a same-sex relationship between two young women to unfold in a world where they don't face the same kind of prejudices and they don't have to protest and resist and fight in the same way as they might today. I wanted to see what other problems they would face, which they might not face today. For example, carrying on a long distance relationship without the internet, without phones, etc. How do you do that? That would be much more difficult, right? So that was what I was imagining. And I imagined this love story set in a courtesan household. And I'm also very interested in female-male friendships that were non-sexual, which also in this poetry emerged. There's these playful female-male relationships where the courtesans basically were able to have friendships with men and conversations with men that were non-sexual, and very few other women could do that. So in this novel, I also described those friendships. I also described the male-male relationships and male-female relationships around them, among their neighbors, their friends, etc. And a lot of this I drew from the poetry and prose of the time that I had studied. Okay, so to go on to the next couple of books, I found that, say, from 1820 to 1920, so 100 years, in this 100 years, all the attitudes change. Not that they change completely. I think some of them still remain, but there is a drastic change from, say, 1820 to 1920, in that 100 years of British rule. In terms of same-sex sexuality, there is definitely a big change. And the change is that as I said, in 1820, these poets are openly writing about same-sex relations at the same time as they're also writing about male-female relations. But by 1920, this nationalist writer who was a follower of Gandhi, Pandey Bechan Sharma, Ugra was his pen name, he wrote a story called Chocolate about a male-male relationship. And it was a very negative story. He is in the sense that he shows the relationship, but he is negative about it, his attitude to it. Yet, even despite that, and when he published the story in 1924, he got a lot of negative reactions from the Hindi literary world. And he was told that you should never write about this. So he, being a very pugnacious and belligerent guy to always do what he was told not to do, he went ahead and wrote 7 more stories on the subject and published them together in 1927 under the title Chocolate. And I had first heard about this book when I was working on this book. And I had asked various people what they knew about literature in different languages on this topic. And one of the gay activists, Ashok Rakavi, told me that an elderly man had come into their office, Humsafar office, and told him that he was alive when this book was published in 1927, and he said all the gay men, they weren't called gay at the time, but all the men who were interested in men, they were thrilled about this book and they all rushed to buy the book. And we know from other historical sources that the book sold out in 1 week. There were lines forming around the block in Calcutta to buy the book, and it sold out, and the second edition came out. So interestingly, even though Ugra, the writer, said that he had written it to criticize and denounce homosexuality, he said his purpose in writing was to tell readers that homosexuality is very prevalent in society at all levels of society. And it is because men are losing their masculinity and becoming effeminate because of homosexuality. That is why the British are able to rule us. That's why he wrote the stories. But the others were not convinced. The other writers were not convinced. There was a huge controversy, and they said, no, we don't believe it, and we don't like these stories. They said this is a subject which should never be written about. It should be unspeakable. It should not be written about in polite society or talked about. Now that is a very interesting statement, because in England and Europe, up to the 20th century, homosexuality was not to be spoken about. It was called the sin not to be named among Christians, unnameable and unspeakable. In India, that had never been the case. In Same-Sex Love in India, we showed that over 2,000 years, or a period of 2,000 years in all languages, same-sex love was openly discussed. It was never unspeakable. The Kama Sutra has a whole chapter on male-male desire and male-male sex, very explicit chapter. So it was never the case, but by 1920, it had become unspeakable. And the Gandhi got involved in the controversy, Premchand got involved, every major person got involved in the controversy. And Ugra was so disgusted that he stopped writing novels and he went off to Bombay and he started writing film scripts, and I'll come to that later. He also wrote this, I translated this book, and I also translated his little autobiography, his memoirs called Apni Khabar, About Me, in which he gives very interesting things emerge. It's the first book to write about domestic violence from the point of view of a victim of domestic violence. His brother used to beat up his mother, and Ugra, who was a smaller child, used to beat them up and get drunk and sell everything in the house to make money to get drunk. And he wrote all about this openly. I think it's one of the earliest books to write about this openly. He also was an actor. He was a child actor in religious theater. He acted the parts of Sita and dressed up as a woman. And he talks about same-sex sexuality in the context of theater, which is very interesting. So, yeah. So I said he went, so finally to come to the last book. I wanted to show you this manuscript. This is the first page of a manuscript of Rekhti poetry by this poet, Nisbat. Now, this is an example of how much literature has disappeared. This poet, when I was working on Rekhti, there were only a few verses available by him in anthologies. So it was assumed that all his work is lost. Some women had also written Rekhti poetry and all their work is also lost. Very few verses remain. So we had no way. But interestingly, this guy called Musharraf Ali Farooqi, writer, he walked into a second-hand bookshop in Pakistan and he found this beautiful original manuscript of this work, which was lying in a second-hand bookstore. And just by sheer chance, he bought it and then he kindly sent me a copy of it. And that's why I was able to include some of this poetry in this book. Otherwise, it was all going to disappear. And that is how, when I said the urgency to do research in Indian languages, because the manuscripts are disappearing. They are not going to be, many of them are not going to survive. So one of my questions when working on this book was, what happened to the courtesan's voice? Because while working on this book, I realized that courtesans, the wives, were central to, and I think in many cities and many cultures, they were central to urban literary culture. They were poets, they were female intellectuals, they lived in matrilineal societies. The property passed from women, from mothers to daughters. Daughters were, and the skills also passed. They were the ones who kept classical music and dance alive. And the skills also passed from mothers to daughters and aunts to nieces. And it doesn't have to be biological daughters. They could be adopted daughters also, adopted nieces. And they were very much respected by the male poets. They were the colleagues of the male poets. They recited, so I found that the male poets would write a song praising a tawaif, a courtesan. The courtesan then would sing and dance to that song. That is, she's advertising herself, but she's also advertising the poet, the male poet whose name is in the poem. So this very playful, intelligent female voice, what happens to this voice once courtesans are removed from the picture, once the British pass laws which say that courtesans are nothing but sex workers, and they were not sex workers, but it turns them into sex workers, and basically by the middle of the 20th century, courtesans have basically disappeared. Others have appeared like bar dancers and so on, but that's not the same thing as courtesans. So I found that one of the places where the courtesan's voice goes is into Bombay cinema. And it went into Bombay cinema. Because many courtesans actually went into cinema. It's not just Bombay cinema, I believe even Tamil cinema. A lot of the early choreographers, dancers, singers, female actors, and in Bombay cinema, producers and directors. And they were not only, in Bombay cinema too, they were not only from North India, they also came from South India and joined cinema. The first woman director, the first woman producer were actually from courtesan backgrounds, they were courtesans. So they shaped cinema, first thing. And second thing, Bombay cinema, Indian cinema I should say, Indian cinema is the only cinema in the world which has courtesans as major characters. You won't find this in any other, I haven't found it in any other cinema. You do have some courtesans in European or in Japanese cinema, but not in the major way in which, so I looked at, I saw 235 films to write about this. And of course, there are hundreds more. I couldn't watch all of them, so I only watched that number. To look at the background of these courtesans and the way the courtesan characters are depicted and how this changes over time. So I started with the films of 1940s and came up to, the book was published in 2017, so up to that time. And you have so many, there's a whole number of films which you could call courtesan films, where the heroine, the main character, is a courtesan. And then there are many other films where she's a minor character, but an important character. So this legacy, the inheritance of pleasure, color, play, you can see it in Bombay cinema songs, in Hindi film songs, where the songs are very often, many of them are ghazals, but they're not all that pining, sad kind of ghazal. There are also the funny, humorous, playful, erotic ghazals, and that is very similar to Rekhti poetry. And one of these, why I have Smita Patil on the cover, is because in the film Mandi, which is all about the wives, all about courtesans, she sings a song. She actually sings a song by an 18th century poet in Shah Human, who was one of the main poets I wrote about. She actually sings his song. She's a courtesan character, and she sings his song in a 20th century setting. So I found, so there is the song. It was remembered. It was not completely forgotten, is my point. And in this book, I made also the argument that courtesans were in Bombay cinema, but I don't know about Tamil cinema, but I'm told that it's very similar. In Bombay cinema, they were the first working women, the first group of women to be shown earning and supporting themselves, the first group of single women, the first group of single mothers. So I looked at motherhood in detail. The first group of women to have relationships with men outside marriage and also in marriage, also get married, but not always. The first group of women to be shown traveling on their own in all kinds of vehicles and owning property in their own rights, owning their own houses, driving their own cars, etc. This is the first group of women to be shown doing that. And I think this mirrored real life. Because as the courtesans came out of, they couldn't be courtesans anymore, they came into cinema, they went into theater, they went into music or dance, classical music or dance. They could, not all of them, many of them were driven into sex work and driven into marriage and became very poor. But those who did succeed, they could earn a lot and become quite famous. And usually they hid their courtesan background because they were now ashamed of it because it had become shameful. So all of these things you see depicted in Bombay cinema. And the one thing though that disappears from cinema, which is there in this poetry and disappears from here, the one thing is same-sex love. That disappears pretty much completely from female-female. So whatever same-sex love there is in Bombay cinema is between men. Between women, it almost completely disappears until very recently, until the last one decade. So, and one more thing which I forgot to mention, one principle which I have operated on in all my research right from here onwards is that I do not judge the text by the biography of its author. So I don't believe in the idea that only men can write about men, only women can write about women, men can't write about women, you can't write about anyone except your own group. If that were the case, then there would be almost no literature left in the world. If you could only write about yourself and your own group, you could then only write a diary about yourself. And even there, other characters would appear who are not the same as you. So whether it's looking at films or whether I'm looking at poetry, I am interested in the biography of the writer, but not to judge the work. I judge the text by itself, by what the text says, and not by the biography of the author. So to give you an example, there's in Same-Sex Love in India, I have translated this story by the Rajasthani writer Vijay Dandetha, which I consider, it's a story about two women who are brought up, one of them is brought up as a man, and they're married off to each other by their parents, and then they fall in love and they remain married. It's a rewriting of a story from the Mahabharata, which is also a folk story. And then one of them gets a gift that she can turn into a man. So she turns into a man. But when they're a man and a woman together, they are no longer the same. When power comes into the equation, they're not happy. And she decides to go back to being a woman. She prefers to go back to being a woman, which is a surprise twist in the ending. And this is, I think, one of the most beautifully written and one of the greatest, I think, the best story on female that has come out in India or that I have seen on female-female relationships. And it's written by a man, Vijay Dandetha, who, as far as we can tell, was, of course, we don't know everything about everybody's life, but as far as we can tell, he was not gay. He was married, he had to a woman, and he had children. So, I don't think that matters. I don't think it's necessarily a better story because you belong to the group, belong to the group you're writing about. It may be more interesting for various reasons. If it's written by a member of the group, it may not be. It may be also really badly written. But I think the imagination is that literature is about the imagination. It's what you're able to imagine and able to put yourself in the place of another. You can never put yourself completely in the place of another, but that doesn't matter because the extent to which you are able to do it is the quality of the work depends on that. Because even when you're writing about yourself, it's not as if we know ourselves completely or we understand ourselves completely. There's a lot we don't know about ourselves. And so when we write about ourselves, it's not necessarily the best writing about ourselves. Somebody else may be able to write a better about us. It just depends, right? So yeah, I think I was told to talk for an hour, but I think that's enough. I'll stop there and then we can have questions. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am, for your very informative and enlightening presentation. We were around 200 people listening to you. It was very informative. Thank you very much. Now the floor is open for discussion. There are a couple of questions in the chat box. Let me read out the questions. Okay. Madhumita Ghosh asks about, can you please specify the chapters in Kama Sutra which are based on male desire?
I've written about it in several places. In Same-Sex Love in India, I wrote about it. Okay, so it's a chapter called Aparishtika in Sanskrit. Aparishtika, which means oral sex. Basically, you could translate in English as oral sex. And it says that there are two types of men. There are men who desire women and there are men who desire men. The ones who desire men are called the third nature, Dvitiya Prakriti. It's often translated as third sex. That's a wrong translation. It means the third nature. The men who desire men can again be subdivided into those who are masculine appearing and those who are feminine appearing. So then it goes on to ask the question, those who are feminine appearing men, they can find other men because they are feminine appearing, so everybody can make out that they are interested in men, yeah? But if they are masculine appearing, then how do they find other men? Because how would anyone know? So this is, of course, when you don't have the internet and the chat rooms and Grindr, then how do you find each other? So it gives very interesting suggestions. It says they can do the job of a flower seller, a hairdresser, a massager, a masseur. They can give massages to other men, and when they're giving the massages, they can gradually figure out if that man is interested or not. It gives, I'm not going to go into the explicit details, but it gives explicit details of how to figure out how they meet each other, how they have oral sex is described in detail. And then it just says, even if they are not interested only in men, any two men, they may not be interested only in men, so it's what we would call bisexual. If they have a very close male friend, maybe they trust each other completely and they can also have a relationship with each other. That also happens, it says. And then it also talks about women in the women quarters, women who are all living together in the women's quarters. They also, it talks about the oral sex that they have. It mentions that as a parallel, but not in detail. So there's a lot more. But yeah, there's a whole chapter called it's called Aparishtika. And in most of the common Kama Sutras which you find being sold in bookshops, they leave out this section. They leave out the whole chapter. So I didn't know the chapter was there. But you have to go to a good translation. Alain Danielou is a good translation. There are many translations where you'll find that chapter also. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. There's another question by Sushil Kumar. He wants you to elaborate difference between bar dancers and concubines.
Concubines? Concubine is a word for a, you mean courtesan? Because concubine is a word for a man's wife, who second, third, fourth, fifth, 50th wife. Kings had many wives, and so the later wives, who are sort of wives but not exactly wives, they are lower status wives, they are called concubines. If you mean courtesans, then courtesans were highly educated and accomplished women who were not sex workers. They had long-term relationships with one man at a time, and they could also get married at times. They were performers of dance and music, but they were also conversationalists. Most of their work was having conversation, witty and literary conversation with men and with each other. And they performed not in bars or anywhere, but in their own homes, or if invited to other people's homes or at the royal court. Okay, so that's the difference. Bar dancers are women who just dance at a bar for entertaining, and this is not classical dance. It is not. It's a different type of skill. So courtesans are the ones who developed classical dance. In Lucknow, they developed Kathak, for example, and they passed it on. In the South, they developed Bharatanatyam, and they passed it on. So they are highly educated, highly accomplished women. They are not bad. That's the difference from bar dancers, and they also were very familiar with the history of music. They learned music. They had teachers who taught them all of this. Yeah.
A question by Marietta Nazareth, MPhil student from the department. She asks, theories are formed from the experiences, and how can the experiences of LGBTQI community, which one often finds shared in virtual platforms, be theorized and used in knowledge production?
Well, I would say a theory is when you look at the data that you have. To give you an example, when I looked at all these young couples, the lives of who got married or who committed suicide. So I look at all of them, I see what do they have in common, and then I build a theory out of that data itself. Say one of my theories was that marriage and death are the two languages that are understood by the community. If you say she is my very close friend, I want to be with her, I don't want to get married, parents won't understand that. They'll say, well, why don't you get married to a man? She can still be your friend. But when you say, I want to marry her, that is the language they understand. And then they say, no, you can't marry her. You say, then I'm going to commit suicide if I can't marry her. Then they understand that this is serious. And this goes back a long way. It is not a 20th century phenomenon. I read the 11th century Sanskrit text, the Katha Sarit Sagar, and there I found these stories of an so-called upper caste man and so-called lower caste woman, and the other way around also, who want to get married, and the parents absolutely forbid it. The princess wants to marry a very poor man. They refuse. And the two then say, we are going to commit suicide. Then the parents get panicky because they don't want them to commit suicide. Then the parents have a dream that these two were married to each other in a former life. And now they are born in different groups. At that time, they were both the royal group. So they should be allowed to get married. So rebirth becomes so one of my theories is, my theory which I drew out of these stories is that rebirth becomes an enabling doctrine. You can use this idea of rebirth to say, yes, we were connected in a former birth, and that is why now we are so attracted to each other, even though it is a socially disapproved relationship. And this is in the 11th century, but in the 20th century and 21st century, I interviewed Hindu priests who had performed these female-female marriages, and other people also interviewed them, and asked, like, why did you perform this marriage? And one Tamil Shaiva priest whom I interviewed, who performed the marriage of two Tamil women, he said, well, I thought about it. I had never thought about it, but I thought about it. And I said, look, the spirit, Atman, has no gender. It's not male or female, right? Most religions would agree on that. Now, if these two are so attracted to each other, they want to get married. Marriage is a meeting of spirits, a union of spirits. It's a sacrament. In Hinduism, at least, it's a sanskara. It's a sacrament, not a contract. They want to marry each other. That means they were attached to each other in a former birth, and that's why they're insistent on doing this. Even otherwise, why would you do it? It goes against, it gets you into so much trouble in society. It means this is an irresistible urge from a former life, and therefore we have to do it. This was one explanation. So rebirth as an explanation this is my theory about rebirth, which comes out of the facts. So that to answer your question about theory, that is how theory arises. It is not something that I come with the formula and impose it on the text, but it arises out of what people themselves are saying. I had never had this idea that rebirth could function in this way, but I got it out of the data, both the ancient data and the modern data. I found that rebirth is functioning in this way. This is people's common explanation for why do you fall in love at first sight? Because you are attached to a former birth. Not only fall in love, but even playfully people say, oh, why do I like this person so much and I don't like that brother at all? It must be because we were connected in a former birth. When you don't have an explanation, then that is the explanation. That is a typically Indic explanation, I would say. So, yeah.
Marietta has another question. What are the prospects of developing queer theory in Indian context?
Queer theory? Without giving it any names, I don't use the word queer, usually I don't. Without using and giving it any names, this is the theory. You're looking at the lives of people who are engaged in same-sex relationships. They may not none of these women call themselves queer or anything. They're not using that word, but they are having these same-sex relationships. And out of that, you draw the theory from what people are doing, what they're saying, how they're explaining their lives, and what in common you see across the data in this period and maybe even in earlier periods. And then you, like this theory of rebirth is a theory I developed, and I don't call it queer theory, but it's a theory applying not just to same-sex relations, it also applies to cross-sex relations. Male-female relationships also are often explained by a previous birth. So it's one possible theory that arises out of one set of data. That doesn't mean that it will apply now across the board to everything and that you have to use it as a formula to apply it to everything, but it applies to certain phenomena. So it is one theory that explains those phenomena. There can be other theories explaining those phenomena too, right? So yeah. I can't hear.
Sorry. In the light of Rekti poetry, can one say that the women of 18th century transgressed the patriarchal framework?
No, I wouldn't say that. Exactly, that's my point. That how are they transgressing when the male poets are writing so happily about it, and they are writing happily about male-male relationships, female-female relationships, male-female relationships, all in the same way? Then obviously they're not seeing it as a transgression, they are seeing it as what people do. And I said the whole idea of the patriarchal framework, yes, there's a whatever you want to call it, a male-dominated framework of society, but within that, all sorts of things are going on in every society. Now, in every society they're going on. In some societies, they are not acknowledged, they are hidden, in this society, they were openly written about. So clearly, it was not seen as a transgression, it was seen as this is just life. Now, that doesn't mean that in real life, in their families, they wouldn't have faced opposition. They did. And that is also described in the poetry, that the husbands get very angry when they get to know about it, for example. And so they would have faced, maybe not the courtesans so much, but the women living conventional lives, domestic lives, they would have faced opposition as well. Though perhaps, and here I'm speculating, but I have come across some evidence that perhaps less opposition to a female-female relation than a female-male relationship, because there you can get pregnant. So, but still, they did face opposition. So, I think that at that time, same-sex relationships were accepted to some extent, as long as they didn't interfere with your getting married and having children, both for men and for women. If you marry, and to some extent this is true even in India today, if you quietly on the side have a relationship, same-sex relationship, but you are still getting married to a woman and having a child, or getting married to a man and having children, you're performing your social role, it's fine. And a lot of people, as we know, lead double lives like this, right? So at that time too, that was going on, except it was more written about and more spoken about more openly. And then as far as courtesans are concerned, who have now disappeared, because they were not living in a conventional household, they could do more things. They were more free to do more things relatively, because they were living on their own in their own households. They were women-dominated households, and they were they had their own money and they were living their own. So they could do many things. They could have relations with men. They could also have relations with women on the side, on their own, in their household. So, yeah.
There's another question. That's by Akhil Yaya. Do you think a psychoanalysis approach of sources help to understand history of sexuality? If yes, do you think the scholar needs to have a fine balance between oral and empirical sources to understand history of sexuality?
Yeah, the whole question of oral sources is one interesting one. I'll come to psychoanalysis later, but the whole question of oral sources is an interesting one. What is called oral is the point about that is that you never know how old that is or who made it up. You hear somebody singing a folk song, you can't assume that that folk song was sung for 50 or 100 or 200 years or even 10 years. For all you know, she made it up just now. You can't assume that the woman says she made it up, therefore she alone made it up. You don't know, right? So when oral sources are written down, when the oral poetry or the oral thing is written down, when it is written down at that moment, you know, yes, this is this period. So if you have something written down in the 19th century, which many were, folk songs are written down, then you know it's a 19th century song. But you can't assume that. You don't know how old it was before that. You can't assume that. You have no way of knowing that, right? You also have no way of knowing the author, because somebody may say that they wrote that they made it up, but maybe they didn't. Maybe it was passed down to them. Women and men may be singing the same songs, different songs, etc. We don't know exactly. So oral sources are very hard to pin down, and that's why we did not in same-sex love in India. We did not go into oral sources. We went only to what is written down, because there one can be sure of the date. Now that doesn't mean one shouldn't do it. Of course one should do it, and you have to use a different sets of methodology for that. It's just not something I have done. As far as psychoanalysis is concerned, that would apply to written as well as oral sources. It's nothing specific to oral sources. I don't find that useful. It's a methodology developed by Freud, who has come in for huge amounts of criticism. I think he's a great creative writer, but I think as a creative writer he's great. But I don't think that many of his theories hold at all are true. So people's psychology varies very widely and is very different in different cultures. And I have read a lot of scholars who have tried to impose their ideas like Oedipal complex onto Indian texts, onto the Mahabharata, and I found it not working at all. I found it completely misunderstanding. I'm now working on the Mahabharata, and I found complete misunderstanding of what is going on in the text. Because we, for example, have in India, we have so many fathers. We don't have one father. We have Chittappa and Periyappa, right? Your father's brother, younger brother, and older brother. They are also fathers of a sort, right? That was not there in the West. So when in the text, when somebody has many fathers and many mothers, we understand that it's perfectly normal for Indians. It's not normal for Europeans. And so they think, oh, something very strange is going on here. One of the scholars says something very odd. There's nothing odd at all to me about it. So you have to, you have to understand the culture to understand what is going on. And I don't think psychoanalysis was developed in the West by Freud in the 19th century and in the 20th century by others, based mostly on American and European experience. And then you can't just pick up that framework and apply it to other cultures, I think. But that's just my point of view. Yeah.
There's a question from Meenu Rebecca. This question is based on the title of your book. Sappho and the Virgin Mary, same-sex love in the English literary imagination. What is virginity of a woman? Is it a woman with no sexual experience or menopausal woman? If Bible is a literature, what is the virginity in Virgin Mary? Is it possible to transcend the conventional method of Christian traditional theology by giving way to feminist theology and making it part of mainstream theology?
Well, in that book, I said that Sappho and the Virgin Mary, who seem to be totally two different, completely different figures, actually have something in common. And what they have in common is that they are both women in a female community, a female reading and writing community. So if you look at European art, the Virgin Mary is always, almost always, shown holding a book and sometimes shown writing also. And Sappho, of course, was a writer. So you have this image of a woman who is not connected to a man and who is surrounded by a female reading and writing intellectual community. And she produces the child herself, and very often she's shown the baby in one hand and the book in the other. And she produces the child through an immaculate conception, which is not sexual. Conception has two meanings, conceiving a baby and then having an idea in your head. And here I would have to show you European art to explain this to you. But the idea that this comes as an idea into a head from the book at the same moment as she conceives the baby. So it's a very interesting idea. It's not a Jewish idea. It's actually a Greek idea. And to come to the idea of the word virgin, virgin in English tends to mean a physical virgin. But in Greek and Roman, Greek religion and literature, there were lots of virgin goddesses who did have relationships with men. They were not physically virgin, but they were called virgin, which means not married, autonomous. For instance, Athena is called Aia Parthenos, which means ever a maiden, always a virgin, which means she's autonomous. She's always a virgin. She's not married to anyone. And that's the same for Virgin Mary. She's also called ever maiden, ever virgin. She's a woman who can do anything in painting and in literature throughout the first millennium AD. She is shown doing everything, being a priest, being in painting and in literature, being a priest, being the most knowledgeable woman in the world, being a writer, being a lawyer, all the things women couldn't do at the time. She does all these things. And she becomes a model for female education, that you imitate the virgin, you learn to read and write. I can show you this through art only, it have to be demonstrated. So I was arguing that these two figures bring female presence and female presence, female intellectual presence, and female same-sex love into the canon of Western literature, particularly English literature. So it's a complicated argument, but that's what I was. Yeah.
Another question is the biological determinant theory support the same-sex couples?
Say that again? I didn't get it. Sorry.
Is the biological determinant theory support same-sex couples?
I don't know what the biological determinant theory is, but I would say, all I can say is that throughout history, in every society and among most animal species also, same-sex relationships have been well documented by scientists. There are two major books. One is called Rainbow of Diversity, and I forget the other. This is about animals, about same-sex relations among animals. So it's very widespread. And in history, we know from ancient Egypt, from ancient Japan, from ancient China, from Rome, from Greece, from India, from everywhere. it's documented that same-sex relationships have always existed. So it's just as biological as any other, as cross-sex relationships.
Another question. It's by. I don't know the. Okay, ma'am, did you come across the issues of gender identity, especially female to male identities?
Yes, that's the famous story of Shikhandan, which I'm now writing about also, and we wrote about in the Mahabharata, and which many people have written about. Right? She's born as Shikhandani, and then she has a miraculous sex change and changes into Shikhandan. So that's a female becoming a male. And then you have numerous stories of males becoming females, in which I wrote about in Same-Sex Love in India. There's a male couple who are very close friends. They dress up as a bride and a groom to trick somebody, and then they're actually changed. One of them is changed to a woman, and then they get married. So they're very close already there, and then so I wrote about this, and there are many such. Men becoming women is a very common thing and a very old idea in Indian literature. Female becoming male, there's Shikhandan's story, which is then rewritten. You were talking about oral literature. There are many, many folk rewritings of the Shikhandan story, the woman who becomes a man. And it's not a uniquely Indian story. It's also found in Greece, this woman becoming a man to be able to marry another woman. So that idea is definitely there. And the Dandefa story, which I mentioned to you, is that same story being rewritten, except she chooses to remain a woman. At the end, she decides, no, I don't want to become a man. I have been a man. I don't like it. I want to come back to being a woman. So that is the remarkable twist in that 20th century story by Vijay Dandefa. But yeah, that's the same story.
There's a question by Srinivasa Ravu Yenda. Is it really surprising and it is really surprising and interesting to know that the pre-modern Indian society has not imposed restrictions on the literature, and it talks about the same-sex relationship. Are we then to believe that the regressive attitude on the same-sex relationships that is visible in modern India is a byproduct of colonial modernity?
Yes, that is what we have argued in Same-Sex Love in India, and what I have argued in later work also. Yes, primarily. I won't say that in the pre-colonial period, I won't say that it is totally accepted. There is still disapproval, there is slight disapproval, but it is not the kind of strong disapproval that comes later. So there is a minor strain of homophobia becomes a major and dominant homophobia in the modern world, in the colonial world, yes. So you can see it in the law, even the 1861 section 377 was brought by the British, right? And the British take over the education system. And from, as I said, you can just see the change in literature. I gave the example of Urdu literature, but it's true of, I think, many literatures, that not just same-sex sexuality, but all sexuality becomes shameful and has to be hidden. Whereas clearly in the ancient and even medieval past, same-sex all sexuality is openly depicted, right? In statues, in paintings, and in medieval miniature paintings, and ancient statues, and Kama Sutra, etc. There's no shame about talking about it, or writing about it, or showing it enough, but it becomes very shameful in the modern world. And that is, yeah, I think colonialism, British colonialism, is the reason, or the primary reason, not the only reason. There are many reasons, but it's the primary reason, yes. And the irony is that then it switches over. By the 1960s, the British have got rid of Section 377, and they are now openly running around semi-naked, and they are fine with being gay, and they've got marriage equality and everything. And in India, we are saying, oh, this is our ancient tradition, and we have to stick with 377. We only got rid of it 2 years ago. So we think it's our ancient tradition. We don't realize it was brought by the British. It's not our ancient tradition at all. So that is because we don't know our ancient tradition. Unfortunately, our British education system doesn't tell us. I never read any, I hardly read any Indian literature after school. In college I didn't. So, yeah.
There is a question by Surbhi Karwa. Does existence equals to acceptance? Meaning thereby, does existence of literature or even its celebration would necessarily mean acceptance of homosexuality?
No, it's not the same thing. So I've never said that it is totally accepted by everyone in the society. That is not the case. We don't know. We don't have people doing surveys in the 5th century AD to know what people's attitudes were. So all we can go by is the written word. And in the written word, so if you look at the Kama Sutra, which is a 4th century text, which is also a religious text, there you see a series of attitudes. So the writer, who is supposed to be Vatsyayan, says some people approve of this, some people disapprove of this. In some regions it's more accepted, in other regions it's less accepted. So he gives a range of attitudes, and he says, as far as I'm concerned, I think he gives his own opinion. You can decide about it depending on your customs, your situation, what you feel, what you think. And so you take all these factors into account and you decide you want to do this or not. And at the end of that chapter on male-male sex, he has this lovely line, which I love, which he says, who does what, where, and when, who knows? So what people are actually doing in their sexual lives, we don't know. So they may be pretending that they may be showing one face to the world. What they're actually doing, we don't know. You can never know about sex, really, what people are doing, right? And but the fact that he can write about it so openly, that he can talk about all these different attitudes, that he can describe oral sex so explicitly, that he can suggest to men that you can go and become a hairdresser or a flower seller to meet other men. So obviously, he doesn't have any huge problems with it, and it's a major text. This is not a minor text. This is a major text which continues to be read and translated for many centuries after. So it tells you something about how far it was. Whereas if you come to early 20th century, you can't speak about it. It's supposed to be shameful, and you're not to talk about it. So clearly, there is a big change, right?
There's another question that is by Nandini Jana. You have talked of using literatures. The ancient temple sculptures also gives evidence of sexual pleasures. Have you seen an instance of same-sex love also there?
In temple sculpture, yes, it's well known that in Khajuraho, for example, there is all kinds of sexes depicted, including same-sex sex of various types. It's very much there. In Khajuraho, it's definitely there, and Konark also it's there, and it has been found in other temples also. It's not my area, but other people have worked on it, and there's somebody working on it right now, in fact, who have found all this. So yes, it's very much there in temple sculpture. It's very much there in medieval miniature paintings produced in the courts of the Mughals, the Rajputs, the Pahari kings, a whole range of kings. They had painters whom they employed to paint, and they painted these medieval miniatures, which show a whole range of eroticism of all kinds and other things also. So, yeah.
There is a question by Jaya Basera. Can you please speak a little bit more about the change in the social standing of the Tawaifs? Were there certain specific policies of British that led to their roles being changed in the society?
Well, 2 or 3 things happen. I've written about this in Dancing with the Nation and also Gender, Sex and the City. 2 or 3 things happen. One is that when the British take over, gradually the Indian princes, both the Hindus and the Muslims, they're losing their power, right? They're losing their power and their authority gradually. And when India becomes independent, then they are abolished. All the princes have gone, right? So the princes, the nobility, their whole culture, they were the ones who were patronizing the Tawaifs, the courtesans, right? They were giving them, supporting them and patronizing them. Once they disappear, the patronage is drying up, right? A different type of patron appears who are businessmen and that kind of traders and all, but they are not that interested in classical music and dance. They don't have they want something chatpata and quick, fun and fast, you know, they don't appreciate that. So the nature of patronage changes. I should have mentioned that another difference between courtesans and bar dancers. Courtesans always covered their entire body. They wore long sleeve clothes. The only thing which was showing was their face and their hands and feet. That's it. Whereas bar dancers, of course, wear very revealing clothes. And that's the difference in patronage. The second major thing is that the British passed a series of laws in the 19th century to regulate the sex workers, and they treated courtesans as the same as sex workers. So they had to be medically examined. They intruded into their households. They medically examined them. They passed laws about them. They constricted them, and they tried to turn them into sex workers. And that's what happens then, unfortunately. Many of them are driven to poverty and they have to be sex workers, or they are driven to get married and just to survive. And a few who are who are lucky as well as highly talented manage to go into theater, they manage to go into cinema, they manage to go into classical music and dance performers, they become performers. So that's what happens to them, but they're dissipated, and the actual courtesan matrilineal household, that disappears, right? These women who go into cinema or theater or whatever, they also get married and they hide their courtesan past, most of them, not all of them, but yeah. So Begum Akhtar is an example.
Another question, this is by Parvaiz Ahmad. Do you see any change in the social acceptability of Muslim courtesans between 18th century and 20th century?
Yeah, one point which I corrected in my book, Dancing with the Nation, it used to be believed, because all scholars had said that most of the Tawaifs were Muslim, and in the films. And when I did a count in the 235 films that I saw, I found that many more Hindu than Muslim Tawaifs. And in real life too, there were the wives in Banaras as well. So they were lot, and in Lucknow. So they were both Hindus and Muslims. One of the interesting things about courtesans is how they had, we talk a lot about syncretic culture, but I don't think it's very often what we think is syncretic is not very syncretic. But in the courtesan household, it really comes pretty close to being syncretic. For one thing, they are having relationships with men from all communities. So their children are of mixed heritage. For another thing, they wear the clothes of all communities. They practice the festivals of all communities. They are a mixed bunch, the courtesans are. You can see this in cinema, where from there, you cannot make out very often the religion of the courtesan. Very often you can, but very often you can't. When I was doing this count, I realized this. When I was counting the number of Hindu and Muslim courtesans, I realized this. So, so the Muslim courtesan change in status is the same as the Hindu courtesan. I don't think there's any major difference. It's all of them go through what I described. When the British pass these laws, when the patronage dries up. In my novel, one of the two women who are having a relationship, one is a Hindu, one is from a Hindu, and one is a Muslim. So yeah, so I don't think there's any drastic difference. Yeah.
Another question that is by Anak. As you always say, queerness is not necessarily a Western construct. How is Indian society seem to think it is modern construct and was not prevalent in India?
That's because most of us don't know history. And so we know only the history that what we have seen in our own lifetime. So if you have grown up in a society in the 20th century where homosexuality is never practiced and it is practiced, but it's never spoken about, never openly spoken about. Like when I was growing up, things have changed now. But when I was growing up, if you never see it talked about on the TV, you never see it in the newspaper mentioned, or you barely see it, it's not mentioned in classroom and anything, then you think, and then it's only mentioned, when do you see it mentioned? The Indian newspapers in the 80s would only mention foreign famous Western gay people. Like I used to collect these clippings, so I know Martina Navratilova, Elton John. These are the only gay people whose names were appearing in the papers and on the TV. So obviously you think this is a Western thing. They must have brought it from the West here. And because you don't know that in the 19th century when the British came here, they found it being practiced here and it was not allowed in their own country and they tried to stop it here. You don't know that. You only know your own lifetime. And now if we look at kids growing up now, they would see on TV so many Indians who are gay and who are openly gay, right? And gay and lesbian, or bisexual. So they would know, they would have a different experience. They would know that it is not only Western, it's also Indian. But in the middle, in the 20s, in the 80s, 1980s, you wouldn't know that because you never heard any Indian being mentioned as gay, ever. So
another question by Anag. The Hindutva proponents justify sexualities and sexual preferences and sexual methods with a reference from the mythologies. What is your take on this?
Do they? I've never come across any of them doing it. If they did, that would be good. If they were willing to accept same-sex sexuality, it would be great. But I've never come across. To some extent, yes, they have changed. They used to be all political parties, I would say, including BJP and CPM and everyone, used to be very anti-same-sex relations earlier in the 80s and the early 90s. And they have changed. Even the RSS has come around and said, yes, it should be criminalized. It came around, took time, but all of them came around to that point. But I have been justifying it. Maybe there are some, but I haven't come across it in any big way. I think the parties basically avoid the question. They say, yes, it shouldn't be criminalized, but now we will see with the same-sex marriage legal cases, we'll see what their position is. So far, I haven't seen any major justification by the ruling parties, but it's there, I don't know.
Okay, that's all for today. It's time to wind up. Let me invite Marietta Nazareth, MPhil Scholar of the department for the vote of thanks. Marietta, please.
Okay, thank you, Jubair. So, good evening to all, and a warm good morning to you, ma'am. I'm so privileged. Thanks on this occasion. Through her erudite lecture on recurring histories of sexuality, Ruth Vanitha has enriched our knowledge, and by showing new ways of looking at sexuality, she has enlightened us. In this August occasion, I'd like to place on record our deepest sense of gratitude to you. Thank you, ma'am. Next, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the Kerala Council for Historical Research for extending their support to this international online workshop, sensing the past thematic departures and archival searches. And we have been very fortunate enough to be backed by a dedicated organizing team. A big thanks to the team also. Further, I express heartfelt thanks to all the participants. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to
Thank you, Dr. Ruth.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.